Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast for all the returning listeners and subscribers, and of course, our very valued patrons. So glad to have you back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way in promoting the channel. Quick reminder before I bring the guest and my co-host in, TIR is a listener-supported program. Without y'all, we couldn't do this. So if you enjoy what we do here on TIR and have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron. For as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can access our patron-only champagne rooms, join us for movie nights, have access to the TIR Discord, and you get the satisfaction of knowing that you help contribute to the insanity that is TIR. Now, on with the show. Neoliberalism with Salafi characteristics. After years of a brutal civil war that has garnered a death toll of over 600,000 people and the displacement of millions more, Syria has new leadership. While the toppling of Assad may bring some instant relief to a country embroiled in a 14-year civil war, will the second verse be much like the first? The Assad regime, as our guest points out, was a 5-decade-long family affair ripe with corruption and neoliberal privatization. Will the new president, Ahmad al-Sharaa, be more of the same? From Djene Bajalan's piece in Compact magazine titled Neoliberalism with Salafi Characteristics. Also, I want to point out that wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description to read the whole article. Quote, on the question of whether al-Sharaa has truly eschewed his past radicalism, the early signs are mixed. On the one hand, he has opted for diplomacy over brute force in his efforts to bring the territories held by the Kurdish-led and U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, under central government control. On the other hand, a wave of vicious sectarian pogroms directed against Syria's al-Wadi community has led many to question the intentions of the newly formed Damascus government. Nonetheless, al-Sharaa has seemingly come to accept both the Syrian nation state and the Republican form of government as legitimate. This is in contrast to the Islamic State, like HTS, an outgrowth of Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, which sought to overturn the Middle Eastern nation states and replace them with a pan-Islamic caliphate. Moreover, al-Sharaa has been at pains to stress that his new administration poses no threat to its neighbors. Not everyone is convinced by this apparent road to Damascus conversion, with Israel, which since the fall of Assad has moved to expand its military presence in southern Syria, expressing skepticism. But perhaps the surest sign that Syria's new rulers seek reconciliation and reintegration into the international order has been their approach to reconstruction, and more precisely, their embrace of neoliberal economic reforms. So join us, that's unquote, join us today as we discuss how Syria got here and what the future holds for a country in transition. To help me with this conversation, I have my man, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mile Hour, the Prince of Miami. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Are you ready for this topic? Did you read Gene's article?
Ready to rock and roll. I read the piece was the day it was published. I liked it very much. I have questions.
Oh, okay. Well, let's bring in the man of the hour. He's also a member of the TIR family. He's a member of the TIR Central Committee. He is the man that put together the intro video for this show. Please welcome Djene Bajalan.
That is my greatest achievement, guys. Putting together the intro video for This Is Revolution. I think it's very much TIR. It's like very much a calling card.
I agree.
Totally.
Well, it's nice to be with you all. I don't get to come on as often as I used to in the past. Things have been very busy for me. So I do miss you. Nobody believes me when I tell them some of my best friends are black, but it's true.
Gene starts right off with a, "We're coming for you," and then there's nothing else you can do about it. Gene, in your piece, you write about the 1960s and Islamic socialism and how the elder Assad, the father, was part of the neoliberal turn in Syria. How did that transition happen? Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So not so much, I wouldn't say Islamic socialism, I'd say Arab socialism. Specifically, we are talking about this kind of heydays in the 1950s and 1960s, where across the Middle East, Syria included, you have a wave of coup d'etats against the existing political regimes, including the monarchy in Egypt and the rise of Nasser, the fall of the monarchy in Iraq, the overthrow of the Syrian government in 1949. So there's basically, you have across large swaths of the Middle East, a kind of shift away from, let's say, more pro-Western orientated governments. Many of these governments sort of were kind of post-colonial governments that, you know, the British and the French had never really withdrawn from. But in the 1950s and 60s, there's kind of this revolutionary wave across the Middle East manifest in a series of coup d'etats against various governments. And in Syria, this takes the form of the rise of the Ba'ath Party in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, you know, partly in response to the rise of very powerful socialist and communist movements, the Ba'athist movement in Syria adopts a program of state nationalization. The state kind of takes the lead in economic development, etc., etc. This is kind of the height of the Cold War, the height of state capitalism, state-led developmentalism, and so on and so forth. However, already by the 1970s, across the Middle East, the luster of that kind of state-led form of economic development is, you know, the wheels are coming off, and we see beginning, you know, in Egypt with the famous, I think it's 1974 Intifah law, the opening law. You see this move away from kind of state-led economic development towards a process of liberalization. I wouldn't call it neoliberalization at this point in history, but in the 70s, we begin to see many of the quote-unquote Arab socialist regimes, Nasserist regimes, begin to move towards, you know, giving the private sector a larger role in economic development. And of course, as time progresses, and especially following the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the kind of impetus behind this process of economic liberalization continues. Under Hafiz al-Assad, you know, Bashar al-Assad's father, in particular in the 1990s, fueled by money from the Gulf, there is a kind of shift towards a greater role for the private sector in economic development. That's not to say that the government completely abandoned the economy. That's not to say all the social welfare provisions had been rolled back, but we begin to see this kind of shift towards sort of a more private sector model of economic development. It's very much this moment, you know, that we think of when we, you know, talk about global history, this end of history moment where the kind of socialist model is seen as a dead end. And so the question is how to move towards a kind of more private sector-led version of development. This is not just in Syria. Even in countries like Iraq, for example, you had, you know, just before the first Gulf War, you know, Saddam Hussein was trying to attract foreign investment, et cetera, into the economy. Now, in the year 2000, Hafiz al-Assad, who's ruled since coming to power in a coup d'etat in the early 1970s, ruled with an iron fist, you know, basically suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood, fought a low-level civil war in the 1980s against the Muslim Brotherhood, was responsible for a lot of massacres, and was hated by many of Syria's Sunni Arab majority. He was a member of the Alawite community, which is a heterodox Islamic sect, more on the Shia side of the spectrum in the Islamic faith. And, just as, in Iraq, Baathism, pan-Arab nationalism served as a vehicle or a cover for the minority rule of the Sunnis. In Syria, you had a kind of similar situation where the Alawite minority from which Assad came from was, constituted the social base of the regime. That's not to say all Alawites were kind of pro-regime. There was a hierarchy, but, Assad kind of based himself in this community. When he died, his son, Bashar al-Assad, became president. Bashar al-Assad was never meant to be president of Syria. His older brother was the one being groomed for power, his older brother Basil, but he died in a car crash in the 90s. And so Bashar al-Assad, who was an optician, I believe working in Britain at the time, is brought back and kind of groomed for power.
Would you say he stumbled into power?
He stumbled into power. He was, he was the second. He was not the heir. He was the spare, and he, became the guy who needed to be. He became the new guy. He comes to power in the year 2000, and there's a kind of echo of our current moment in Syria. I think a lot of people hope that, the old hardlined military officer, Hafez al-Assad, his son, who's like a mild-mannered optician, would sort of take the country in a different direction, would open the way for a kind of political liberalization in the country. And you have this moment in the early 2000 where it's known as the Damascus Spring. There's a kind of open political atmosphere. A lot of Arab Syrian intellectuals come together. They establish civil society organizations, discuss the future of the country. And then alongside this, as I mentioned, there is already this move towards liberalization of the economy, beginning in the 70s and really picking up in the 90s. But under Bashar al-Assad, alongside promises of political reform, there's this promise of economic reform. Remember, at this moment in history, people think, neoliberalism can deliver the goods to people. All we need to do to build our country up is to, encourage the private sector, unleash the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So the political side of this liberalization project doesn't last very long. By 2001, basically the intelligence state, what they call the mukhabarat, the intelligence services, the intelligence state really reasserts itself. Opposition figures are people critical of the government are put in jail, and again, basically everything is clamped down on again. But when it comes to the economic reform, between 2000 and the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, there is basically a kind of intensification of neoliberalization. Hafez al-Assad, for example, had kept international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank at arm's length. Under his son, they come into the country. Business rates are cut, parts of the economy, land are privatized, taxes are reduced. The agricultural sector is hit, to my understanding, is hit particularly hard by this. And of course, at the same time, you have the rolling back of the social welfare state. One of the reasons for Hafez al-Assad's success in the past, of course, had been violence, but there's also was a kind of social contract where the Syrian state would look after you. This, of course, is rolled back as part of this neoliberal project. And so we have a period of time where, Syria is enjoying like 5% a year GDP growth. But that growth is being siphoned off to a political elite tied to the state. Neoliberalism is very, how can I put it, very susceptible to the authoritarian model of government, because the government decides who gets contracts, can use its influence, and you have the formation of a kind of new upper capitalist class, business class in the country, many of whom are relatives of the president or have political connections to the president, and they benefit very much from this neoliberal economic term. Perhaps the kind of best example that I could speak of in this, of this is Rami Makhlouf, Assad's cousin, who becomes this huge, big businessman, controls large parts of the economy: telecommunications, oil and gas, construction, banking, aviation, retail. You basically have a lot of the wealth of the country accruing in the hands of private individuals, but individuals who are politically connected. And and as I said, on the top line, it looks like the economy is going okay. You have this growth, but that wealth is really just going to a small elite, as well as the kind of foreign capitalists who are investing in the country at the time. For the vast majority of the population, you see a stagnation of wages. You see inflation becomes a big problem in the country. There's growing economic inequality. There is a decline in the public services, and the agricultural sector, along with these economic reforms disrupting the agricultural sector, especially in the late 2000s and early 2010s, you have environmental conditions which exacerbate these problems. You have large numbers of people moving from the countryside to the city. So you have a country that on paper looks like it's doing quite well economically, but in practice, this period is one of extreme difficulty for large parts of the Syrian population. And because, of course, of the sectarian nature of the Syrian regime, this economic, growing economic disparity is kind of refracted through a sectarian lens. So sort of sectarian divides kind of heat up during this period as well. And then eventually, of course, as everybody knows, in 2011, as part of the Arab Spring, as part of this broad kind of popular rebellions against kind of sclerotic regimes across the Arab world, we have a rebellion in Syria. And of course, as they say, the rest is history. And, from 2011 onwards, we have this extremely bloody and brutal civil war breaking out, which, at first begins with popular protests, then sort of degenerates into kind of armed insurgency. And of course, as everybody knows, neighboring countries, the United States, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, everybody gets involved in this conflict. And, it
becomes messy, and
it becomes very messy for a long time.
And I think it was 3 or 4 million people have been displaced. You wrote.
I mean, yes, millions. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's something you have something like 7 million people fleeing the country. You also have a lot of internally displaced people as well, people who have been forced to leave particular parts of the country as well. So it's a really chaotic situation. And I would say also as well, Syria has suffered from what we might think of as the brain drain as well. Many of the people who were able to leave the country tended to come from the middle and upper classes, the more educated elements of society as well. So you have this kind of country that is devastated, both in a physical sense. I think I mentioned in the article, in 2019, there were estimates that to rebuild the country, it would cost between $250 and $400 billion.
Billion with a B, yeah.
With a billion, yeah. And just checking my figures right here, yes, it's over the course of the Syrian civil war, the country's GDP has been cut in half. 6 million have fled the country, and as I said, many of the most educated elements of that society, and there are up to 8 million internally displaced. And before the Syrian civil war, I think about a third of the country lived below the poverty line. Now that number is 90%. So this is a country that is devastated, that is exhausted, that is very much at the mercy of the international community. Don't forget, sanctions which were placed on the Assad regime are still on there, are still on the country. And of course, that like even today with the fall of the Assad regime, you can't transfer, let's say, remittances. That is money that, let's say, Syrian refugees in Germany might want to send money back to their family in Syria to help them, but they can't even do that because of the particular sanctions regime.
Pascal, I know you want to follow up with something.
I had several questions. I mean, in many ways, do we not see the current condition of Syria as one of the fulcrums of the kind of devastation that has wreaked havoc in Muslim countries in the post-war on terror world overall? Even though Syria was not one of the initial countries attacked during the war on terror, like Iraq or like Afghanistan, but it was it was one of the countries that was focused upon by I think Wesley Clark talked about 7 countries that the United States wanted to attack after 9/11. Now Syria came into the crosshairs, and the devastation that Syria underwent. How much can we ascribe to that, to the mismanagement of the Assad regime, and how much can we ascribe to that, to the role of political actors internationally interfering with the attempt of the Assad regime to get control of his government?
I think that's a great question, Pascal, because I think Iraq and Syria offer like two, let's say, alternative experiences. Obviously the cases in Iraq, you had a brutal but relatively stable regime that was overthrown by the United States and then dissolved into chaos, right? In Syria, I think it works slightly differently. You have these kind of popular uprisings. The Assad regime clamps down on those uprisings quite brutally. But of course, there are many different actors. Every time a civil war breaks out in a country, well, it's a free-for-all where every single power out there that sees an advantage to promoting their particular side in that civil war gets involved. So it seems to me quite reasonable, for example, to assume that the length of the Syrian civil war is, this 14-year war is, probably the result of external intervention, not just the intervention of the United States, but also Turkey, Russia, Iran, various different forces that had gotten involved. So I think the breakdown of the Syrian regime was perhaps largely the result of internal factors within Syrian society, but the kind of trajectory of the civil war and its length was obviously exacerbated by the intervention of various various powers in those revolutions. You look at any revolution throughout history, there are foreign interventions. I mean, as you well know, Pascal, Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, was a commissioned officer in the army of the Spanish Empire.
Yes.
That doesn't mean the Haitian Revolution was a conspiracy promoted by Spain, merely that Spain sought to seek advantage in that revolution to advance its position in the New World. So I would say, in terms of the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, there are a lot of different factors involved, but I think that they can be primarily located in the kind of economic crisis in the country brought about by neoliberalization, environmental degradation, which exacerbated that problem. I remember very vividly in the late 2000s, in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is just across the border, there were big issues with grazing lands, for example. People, the Arab Shamma tribe, which is a very big tribe that lives between Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, they came into Kurdistan because their traditional grazing lands had been, decimated by desertification. And then, of course, on top of this, you have a sclerotic regime that is, unable to adapt itself to the political moment, that is unable to overcome the crisis. Even those, for example, news outlets that have, during the course of the Syrian civil war, have generally taken a kind of Assad-friendly approach. Even those people have complained in retrospect that, you know, one of the problems that Assad has, that he was just not willing to do the necessarily reforms, political reforms, to loosen his grip on power that might have allowed his regime to survive. So, you know, so the Assad regime, you know, I think, you know, very much there's a certain strand of left-wing political thought, especially in the West, that views the Syrian civil war as being a kind of product of an American conspiracy. But I think that is an oversimplification of the affairs. My understanding is you have the outbreak of the civil war, and then with Syria's weakened position, like jackals, the great powers jump on the carcass of Syria in an effort to tear off their peace, as it were. And hello to Spencer, who's in the chat. I hope that answers the question, Pascal.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Gene, you write the new Syrian government will hinge on its ability to rebuild the country's shattered economy. Since the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, Syria's GDP has been cut in half, and over 6 million Syrians have fled the country, including many of the most educated elements of society. Of those who remain, including upward of 7 million internally displaced people, some 90% now live below the poverty line. My question for you is, with a massive brain drain and economic drain on the country, what options does Syria have outside of looking to the IMF or World Bank for help?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, the end of history comes for us all, and it came for HTS or al-Sharaa and his guys. I mean, I think, you know, what we have at present in Syria is we have a political movement in power that has emerged out of the insurgency in Iraq, al-Qaeda, and shares, as I wrote in the article, shares political DNA with groups like the Islamic State. But al-Sharaa, who broke with the Islamic State and broke with al-Qaeda as well, you know, went on a different path. The experience of the Syrian civil war set him on a different path. To use a kind of facetious analogy here, the Islamic State embraced a kind of Islamic Trotskyism, by which I mean, you know, their objective was not simply to seize power in Syria. Their objective was to overthrow the nation-state system that prevailed in the Middle East, that had prevailed in the Middle East since the early 1920s. They sought to break down the political boundaries that separated the various nation states of the Middle East. And on the carcass of that system of nation state, they sought to erect a neo-caliphate. They sought to reject the kind of political forms and norms of Western liberal democracy and socialism, and establish a kind of new caliphate. If you want to think of it, you know, I often think of it like, the way I would compare it is, I don't know if anyone's seen, there's an episode of South Park where a bunch of Civil War reenactors get drunk and then accidentally nearly conquer the United States. It's kind of like that. You had these kind of the Islamic State, who were almost LARPing being the early Islamic conquerors, as Pascal knows well. If you are a Muslim or you are familiar with the Muslim tradition, the name Abu Bakr is extremely important, because Abu Bakr was the first of the rightly guided caliphs. So the Islamic State's direction, the direction they went, was a kind of what I would like to call permanent counter-revolution, where they would spread, overthrow the nation states, overthrow the republican forms of government, overthrow the monarchical forms of government, and erect this sort of neo-caliphate on that, very brutal regime. Al-Sharaa has gone a different direction. Although coming from this jihadi Salafi position, he's moved closer to a political model that we see in countries like Turkey, where the Islamist movement has made peace with the nation state and has made peace with the republican form of government. So al-Sharaa has not declared himself the Khalifa. He is not, he's not called upon for the formation of a pan-Islamic or pan-Arab state. In fact, there are currently rumors, I don't know how true they are, that al-Sharaa is even looking to make peace with Israel at the moment, in order to kind of consolidate his hold within the Syrian nation state. That doesn't mean they haven't abandoned their desire to impose a conservative Islamic Sunni political order on the country. But there is a recognition that for them, if the priority is to build this, let's say, more Muslim, more Sunni Syria, the key to their success is going to be economic development. And the key to success in economic development is integration into the global capitalist system. So what does that look like? Well, in many ways, it is a kind of reboot of the neoliberal political project that Bashar al-Assad had embraced during the early 2000s. Now, during the war, obviously, foreign investment and all that stuff goes by the wayside, and it's kind of moved towards maintaining state control because of the exigencies of the war, etc., etc. But now that the war is over, Bashar al-Assad is gone, there's a kind of reboot of this neoliberal political project. And of course, as many people will be like, many people in the West, many people on the left will be like, well, that's terrible and things like that. But you have to look at the perspective from the average Syrian person. They don't want civil war anymore. They just want, what everybody else wants: cheap consumer goods and stability. I think al-Sharaa embraces a vision of turning Syria into something like, Istanbul, Dubai, these kind of places. I think this is the economic vision is shaped by neoliberalism. So, the end of history comes for al-Qaeda, even comes for al-Qaeda. The market will tame you. And the necessity of embracing capitalism in order to maintain your legitimacy becomes necessary. Because what is the alternative? That Syria remains 90% impoverished and under sanctions. So the government doesn't really have much leverage. So it's trying to open up the country and is embracing this economic model. And it's probably not going to have the same problems in the longer term.
Well, let me ask you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you this? And I hate to cut you off, and I know you want to get in and ask, but I just want to ask this quick follow-up question, Pascal and Djene. Do you then see another civil war in the makings, or can this new leadership avoid that with, as you said, cheap consumer goods?
Well, it's going to come down to before any of this can come into being, Jason, is that the country still doesn't have a political resolution, right? There's still not a political resolution. We say the civil war is over, but the civil war isn't really over. It's just that the old regime is gone. You still have multiple factions in the country. You've had these horrific pogroms against Alawites on the coast. Although al-Sharaa has sought to centralize political authority, our friend Alex McKeever has talked about that quite extensively, under his control, bring these groups under his control. He still doesn't exercise full control over them. You have the SNA, the pro-Turkish Islamist groups doing their own things as well. You have the various Kurdish political groups aligned with the PKK, controlling 1/3 of the country. You have Israel expanding its occupation in the south, Turkey occupying territories in the north, the United States occupying military bases in the country. Al-Sharaa has an economic vision, but of course, whether they can even get that economic vision off the ground depends on if they can get a political settlement that gives some semblance of normalcy to the Syrian regime. So we have this transitional period taking place. We have this kind of transitional constitution. There was a big assembly of various militia groups that proclaimed al-Sharaa the interim president of the country. There'll be al-Sharaa has signed a kind of memorandum of understanding with the Kurds. There are negotiations going on. So, Syria, if this, even before this neoliberal political project can get off the ground, they have to actually unify the country or find some kind of stable political order for the country. But the fact, one of the things that I found most striking is that the Syrian finance minister's first interview was given with what newspaper? Financial Times, right?
Mm-hmm.
While he was on the way to Davos. And I think that's a kind of, they're setting down their stakes. They're saying, hey, we want to play ball with the international order. We want to attract investment. And, I would say, like, it might, if they do get a political settlement, it might even work for a while, right? It might even work.
The fact that he's going to Davos is a bigger statement than anything else.
Well, does that also protect them from any sort of Israeli insurgency?
Well, that's the big question.
Coming off a civil war and losing what sounds like maybe more than half of your population, we don't know how many of those are like able-bodied men. Like, what are you really left with? To try to fight.
Israel has one of the reasons al-Sharaa came to power, of course, is Israel, right? Mm-hmm. Not so much directly, but the Assad regime was like horrendously incompetent, and even by the end, guys close to the regime were like, what is this guy doing? He's leading the country into the mess. The Iranians were sick of him. The Russians were annoyed with him as well. And al-Sharaa has reached out to the Russians as well, so he's not burned those bridges as well. But yeah, Israel and Turkey are occupying large parts of the country. Israel, what was their present for the new regime? To bomb the entire military infrastructure. Now, one of the reasons that al-Sharaa was successful, there's two reasons, I would say. Russia was obviously distracted with Ukraine since 2022, so it hasn't been able to intervene to the same degree to support their client. Iran was getting kind of hammered, and not so. The Israelis were bombing Iranian diplomatic targets, and ultimately for Iranian foreign policy, Syria was a battleground, but it was a piece of territory that they could afford to lose. And of course, Hezbollah, which had intervened in support of Assad in the past, was delivered a bloody nose by the Israelis. The Israelis didn't defeat Hezbollah, but they certainly curtailed their capacity, which opened up, which meant that you had Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, three of the critical external supporters of the Assad regime, in weakened political positions, as well as being a bit sick of the Assad regime. And so that provided the opportunity for al-Sharaa to kind of push on the facade of the Assad regime, which collapsed extremely quickly. And this should be an objective lesson to people who like to watch certain media, certain anti-imperialist media, that confirms their biases. I watched several independent media sources all throughout November and December proclaiming the defeat of HTS and that Assad would survive. And they were all, including Scott Ritter and his young Asian boyfriend on their podcast, who, they may have wanted the Assad regime to survive, but it was collapsing, and they misinformed, let's say, some of their audience because of their wishful thinking.
Pascal?
Yeah, I always felt, quite frankly, that this becoming a stalking horse for the quote unquote nominal left in the United States, are you an Assadist or not, was some of the dumbest crap I've ever seen in my life. That, no one wanted the United States to go in and attack Syria, but at the same time, anyone who thought that Assad was some kind of like liberating agent of the downtrodden was a obvious dupe, and this was evident to me that one of the sad realities of the American leftists, because there's no left in America, is that everyone had to take a camp in this much more nuanced, strategically more clouded region than the simple, like, oh, you're an Assadist or you're an agent of the United States. And I just wish that people had more sense than to fall into that kind of stupidity, quite frankly.
I mean, with the to borrow a turn of phrase from Dune, the Syria was counter-revolutions within counter-revolutions, right? The Assad regime is not particularly good, but neither. I mean, and as you will know, Pascal, as a Sunni Muslim, Assad was not very popular among Sunni Muslims for his actions against Muslims. Sunni Muslims in Syria, deeply hated, a hated person, and I would say the Iranians basically got sick of Assad by the end of it. There's even been discussions, and I don't know how accurate these news reports have been, that Assad was feeding the Israelis intelligence and playing a double game, feeding intelligence on the Iranian assets that were located in Syria. So, we don't know. We'll see over time. But I think the Iranians basically thought this was a pointless battle, especially because Assad wouldn't make any necessary political reforms that might kind of allow the country to come to some kind of political resolution as well.
Well, the ultimate 800-pound gorilla in a room that signed his death warrant was when the Russians decided to pull out support and tell him to basically back off, which, as you alluded to, was clearly as a consequence to them being in a quagmire in Ukraine. So, Joe Biden himself was celebrating the fact that Assad regime fell, and he was taking credit for the fact by literally saying that he triangulated the Russians in Ukraine, causing the fall of Assad. So, I don't know how much we want to take that as a sign of credulity for Joe Biden, but at the same time, it still leads a horrible mess in the Middle East for Syria, and it doesn't help these millions of Syrian people who are being displaced, who have been displaced, who are now in a political quagmire where a former al-Qaedist is now leader of the country.
I mean, I find it absolutely amazing how many people in the West seem to be whitewashing the fact that this guy is a former al-Qaeda militant, because it's indisputable. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean that he has the same politics he did when he was an insurgent in Iraq. People change over time, etc., etc. But this is no doubt, this is a victory for a particular brand of Islamic politics. And while I think probably many Syrians would be glad to see the back of Assad, I think, there's a lot of apprehension about what this new regime is going to look like, because you have some very nasty political forces aligned with al-Sharaa. Even if al-Sharaa is trying to keep them on a tight leash, right? Even if he's trying to keep them under control, you have very radical Islamic forces. You have foreign fighters, Uyghurs, Chechens, etc., etc. You have these pogroms directed against minorities. One of the things that sustained the Assad regime was the support that it often garnered from minorities, not out of any particular love for Assad, but the idea that, well, if it wasn't for Assad, these Sunnis would massacre us, right?
Yeah.
And, this sectarian politics, and I want to emphasize this thing. This sectarian politics is not an inevitable outcome of thousands of years of history, right? At various points of history, there has been moments where different religious groups and sectarian groups have cooperated together. During the French Mandate period, you had cross-sectarian organizing against colonial rule, etc., etc. But political forces, especially the French, and then later the Assad regime, deliberately manipulated and intensified sectarian divisions as part of their mechanisms through which they maintained power. And this is a very dangerous form of politics. And then, of course, when the Civil War broke out, other powers, including the United States, became involved, and this in turn intensified these kind of sectarian divides. It's my hope that Syrians are tired enough of this sectarian violence. I was speaking the other day to a Syrian activist who said that many Syrians, for example, had been very angry at the Kurdish political forces in Syria, but when al-Sharaa and Muslim Kobane signed an agreement, there was just general joy that this had been resolved diplomatically. I think there is a desire, and I can't blame Syrian people. There's a desire to end this conflict. So there are both centrifugal and centripetal forces in operation in Syria. And I'm hopeful, I hope, although I'm not particularly confident, that at the very least, there can be some kind of humane stability in Syria that will allow some kind of reconstruction going forward. That Syria can be opened up to the rest of the world, that Syrians living around the world can begin to send money back, and there can be some kind of reconstruction. Whether that will provide a truly stable political order in the future, I don't know. I am very, how much faith should we have in neoliberalism with Salafi characteristics and its ability to construct a future for the Syrians? I don't know. But maybe the most intense and brutal and violent phases of the Syrian civil war, which has left, hundreds of thousands of people dead, maybe that can come to an end. And at least, even if the government is terrible, at least you can have relative social peace in society, which will allow not only physical and material reconstruction, but also the reconstruction of civil society and social life in the country.
Well, thank you very much for that.
So Gene, sorry, if Syria makes a neoliberal turn, do you think this will be the moment of peace then, in that neoliberal turn?
I mean, I just don't. I don't think Syria has much of an option. Like, it needs money. It needs reconstruction money. They can't. Where are they going to get it from? They have to get it from abroad. So
MMT.
Yeah, I mean, they could MMT it, but I don't think that's gonna.
That's not gonna work.
Whereas I don't think that's gonna. I don't think that's gonna work. I think, like I said, it's the end of history comes for everybody. There isn't another model in town. Perhaps they can have slightly more state. I mean, like, they're not stupid. For example, the Syrian government announced it was going to cut the government services.
You talked about that in the piece, that they're going to have a Doge style.
Yeah, it's like
cutting of government employment.
It's the Doge jihad, right? They're doing the Doge jihad. But at the same time as they're doing that, they've raised salaries 400%.
Wow.
Like, there is a recognition that if people have seen how this plays out in other countries, right? So there is a recognition amongst the new elites that we can't, go too far with the shock therapy. There has to be some kind of trade-off as well. But like, what leverage does Syria have? Who's going to pay? Like,
well, if look, kind of what you're saying, and how Pascal feel about this, if the bleeding is stopped, the war, the guns are down, right? Does that bring in Western capital?
It's going to bring in Turkish capital. That's what it's going to.
Is that better or worse?
Well, it's like Turkey is like, it's like a bottom feeder imperialism, right? Like, where does Turkey like? Turkey needs to like. Where does Turkey invest? Tonight, man. Where does it invest?
Yeah.
Libya.
Yeah.
Somalia, and then probably Syria. Basically, places where like nobody else wants to go, right? I mean, and Turkish business class is like ready for those kind of quote unquote Wild West.
But what does that mean for certain populations within the country, though?
I think Syria has a historical. Syria holds a certain place in the consciousness of the Muslim world where it will be able to get more money than just from Turkey. I think that the Gulf Arabs would be willing to fork over some cash for Syria as well.
Yeah, there's a quote here, and I want to address this. Syria was part of the axis of resistance to Israel in Gaza. Was it? Was it part of the axis of resistance in Syria? I mean, what did it do? Did it do anything? It didn't do anything. You know, the Assad regime had long since given up on taking any kind of aggressive action against Syria, right?
It's Israel, yeah.
Against Israel, yeah. They've long given up. In the sense that the main political forces, for example, Hezbollah, their main external patron was Iran, and Hezbollah's image within the Islamic world was somewhat tarnished by their involvement in the Syrian civil war. So, you know, in response to that statement, I would say, like, you could equally say you can't not celebrate. You know, if you don't celebrate the fall of the Assad regime, you can't really pretend you give a shit about the Syrian people. It's like a very reductive way of looking.
And who's saying exactly that you have to go around celebrating the fall of Assad? I don't think anyone out here is talking about going on.
I mean, I think the question is not about celebrating or not celebrating. I mean, like I said, I would draw a comparison with Iraq. Like, you know, when Saddam Hussein initially fell, most Iraqis were like, good, he's gone. They might not have been happy with the way that he was gone, but they weren't sad to see the back of him. Many of them were actually annoyed, like, why didn't the Iraqi army remove him years ago? You know what I mean? They were like, he should have been removed years ago. He led the country into disaster after disaster. But that doesn't mean what's coming forward is going to be better, right? And I think, you know, we don't know what direction politics are going to take in Syria at this particular moment in time. Like I said, I'm very skeptical of what this new regime is going to look like, how it's going to shake out. I fear that we'll just end up with a new kind of Sunni-dominated majoritarian Syria, as opposed to the old Syria that was a minoritarian regime. So, you know, it's a particularly disastrous state of affairs at the moment.
Well, thank you, Djene, for taking the time to come on the show and talk with us. Thank you, Pascal, for taking the time to come on and help with us. Do you have anything to say in closing, Pascal?
No, this was a great piece of work by Djene. I appreciated his contribution.
Well, thank you very much.
Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show, there's links in the description to Djene's piece in Compact. Neoliberalism with Salafi characteristics. There is no champagne room tonight, as we have a big show on Saturday that we must get ready for. Is hip-hop journalism a pathway to the manosphere?
Who's the guest for that show?
You.
We coming for you, nigga.
There you go, Pascal. You, me and Toussaint, the Blackies.
Oh, joy, joy, joy.
Joy, joy, joy. I got the joy, joy down in my heart. But seriously, Gene, there was a very thought-provoking article. And I think this show for a lot of people is kind of deep because there's no simple solution to this problem.
No, there's no. I mean, like, and obviously, this is extremely tied to the Palestinian question. And if I could just kind of like, I attended a panel with groups of Syrians yesterday who were discussing the future. And one of the big conundrums that is going to come up for this new regime is the question of Palestine. Because on one hand, in order to consolidate power in Syria, basically the al-Sharaa regime has no option but to play nice with Israel. Because if they don't play nice, the Israelis will keep on taking land from Syria and will pressure the United States to maintain the sanction regime. And obviously, who's going to suffer from that? The Syrian people. But on the flip side, the Palestine question is a real question for the Syrian people. And playing too nice with the Israelis will ultimately be a major issue for legitimacy of this regime. The states that are able to make peace with Israel are deeply authoritarian, because the general public, even if they don't want to necessarily go to full-on war with Israel, they don't want to deal with this Israeli government at the moment. So this is going to be a serious conundrum for the regime, the new regime going forwards. How can they relate to Israel? How can they square the circle of their, concrete political need to assert their authority across the country, which in certain ways is dependent on Israel not intervening and destroying their infrastructure, while at the same time maintaining their legitimacy amongst the Syrian population, who has a deep sense of sympathy towards the Palestinian population. So we're going to see how this goes in the future, but it's going to be, and especially if the Israelis continue to invade more and more of southern Syria, I think this may prove like something that even the government can't really deal with if if popular unrest against an Israeli occupation grows. Damascus is not far from the Golan Heights. The Israelis could get there very quickly. So there's a lot of there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. So we'll have to see how things go in the future, because you can't keep capitulating to the Israelis and maintain your legitimacy, especially as there's a kind of ongoing massacre taking place in Gaza.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Pascal. We'll be back Saturday for Me the Morning. Again, wherever you're watching and listening to the show, there's links in the description. We appreciate all of you. And we are... This is kind of a deep show. Let's go out with some cartoons. We're out.